was born in New Orleans. I'm the oldest of 5 children, and my father was an electrician. My mother was a florist. They've both since passed away. My mother also had a gift shop. And I went to Mata Dolorosa School on Carrollton Avenue until I was in 4th grade. My mother was from Washington Parish, and my parents decided they wanted to flee the city and move to what we now call the suburbs. We still call the country, really, in my family. So my parents spent weekends building a home right outside of Bogalusa, and we moved there. And I went into Annunciation Catholic School until the 8th grade. And at that point in time, my parents decided they wanted me to continue my high school education in a Catholic school. So I went to Dominican and boarded at Dominican High School in New Orleans. After I graduated high school, I went on to University of Southwestern Louisiana in Lafayette. After I finished college, I taught for several years. Married, waited a while, had a child, and then went on to Loyola Law School. Graduated there in 1979. I've often wondered why I wanted to be an attorney. And I can remember being in Washington, D.C. on the steps of the United States Supreme Court. And I just had an absolute thrill go through me, imagining being able to be a lawyer, argue cases that perhaps would help people with their lives. I made up my mind then that if I ever got the chance, I would apply to law school and try to be a lawyer. There are no lawyers in my family. I'm the only one. But there's just something in me that made me want to try to practice law. So after my son was born, I took the LSAT and then enrolled in Loyola's night classes. It took me 7 years to get through Loyola. I tell people the commute, which was 70 miles, was for night school. That made it a little easier. I could do the mommy things and the things I needed to do during the day, and then would leave home about 5:30 to get to my classes at night. And I would get home about 11 o'clock at night after my classes. My son, who was, when I was in law school, he was between the ages of 2 and 5, would wait up. And he'd be awake at 11 o'clock when I would come home in time for me to have mommy time again and read to him his bedtime stories. And of course, when I got up in the morning, he would sleep until it was time for him to go to his pre-K school or kindergarten and me to get ready for class and then to go on to New Orleans. But that drive, that 70-mile drive across the causeway, was the most peaceful time of my day. I could do a lot of thinking and a lot of praying during that time. Then when I jumped to going to law school, I clerked for Mr. Gillespie my senior year in law school. It was hard to find the time to do that any other time, but senior year our schedules weren't as heavy. And the senior year at Loyola, I had to be on campus during the day, so I wasn't going at night. So I did clerk for Mr. Gillespie. And as an aside, what helped me so much when I took the bar exam, one of the questions was draft a petition to be filed in federal court. Well, so many people after the break said, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know what a petition in federal court looked like. Did it have hearts and flowers on the side of it or what?" Well, because I had clerked, I saw those petitions and I saw what they should look like, and I knew what you should put in your opening pages and your allegations. So that's why, once again, I go back to Mr. Gillespie being a very positive influence. And my clerking experience was one of the best things I ever did. I stayed with Mr. Gillespie and Mick Paduta for 5 years, and then I opened my own practice. And I've been practicing solely since 1984. I had a very supportive family outside of just my marriage. I had a mother and a sister, and my son was the same age as my sister's 2 boys, so they were like brothers. So they spent a lot of time together, leaving me time to study and get ready for the next week in class. When I was graduating from Loyola, the dean called me in and said, "I just found out you commuted and you have a young child. Would you like me to put that on your record here so that when you go interview, people know what you've accomplished already?" I said, "No, sir, just give me my degree." I know what I want to do, and what I wanted to do was to come to this small area, raise my child here, and practice here. So no, I have no regrets. How did a young lady handle, so to speak, the man's world of law? It was very easy in this parish. I never felt that I was being discriminated against, that I was being ridiculed, that I was being ignored. Now, sometimes out-of-town lawyers would step over what I considered the bounds, but once they realized that I was not going to back down from their remarks or their insinuations, then they became friends. And I can say that I really hold no grudges against any male for the treatment I received in these 30-plus years of practicing law. The changes in the law in the early 80s opened up the door to having a domestic practice, because there were so many changes, as in the child support guidelines, as in the child custody guidelines, as in the fact that, and I love to say this when I did public speaking, men were no longer head and masters of their households, meaning that they could not mortgage the home without the wife's signature. One time I was speaking to a ladies group here in Franklinton at a home, and I said, I think you ladies need to go home and tell your husbands that he's no longer head of household. The owner of the house, a male, heard me say that and came down the stairs saying, "Get that woman out of my house right now." Of course, that didn't go very far. The ladies laughed at him, but that was a fun thing. And I used to love to begin my speeches, especially to all male audiences, the Rotary's Chamber of Commerce. "Gentlemen, you are no longer head and master of your household." And boy, those eyes would get big. And then I had to explain I meant that in a legal, civil context. What the relationship was with his wife and children was up to him. But legally, he had to have his wife's cooperation if he was going to mortgage the family home or borrow money. She became an equal partner, and that's what opened up the door to a domestic practice. And that's why I had a strong domestic practice for many years. Well, I started out with what we call our squire, John Gillespie, who's practiced over 50 years. He's just recently retired. He's in his mid-80s now. John Gillespie and Mick Paduta had an ongoing practice and gave me a chance, for which I was very grateful. But when I went into the practice, John was the city attorney for the city of Bogalusa, and Bogalusa was being sued in federal court by 4 ladies who were police dispatchers. They wanted the same benefits as if they were policemen, civil service benefits. The city was opposing that. Well, it was at the lower level in the federal court, and Judge Hebe ruled in favor of the 4 police dispatchers, females. It was appealed, and I got designated, first time I've ever had an oral argument, to go before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal and make the argument of why these women should not be treated as police officers. Opposing counsel made the mistake, I don't know if he didn't look up at the panel, but he made the mistake of saying, "Typical city sending a woman to make this argument." Well, you look up and there's 2 females sitting there on the panel. That was the wrong thing to say, but they decided it correctly anyway. In a small town, you have to have diversity. And I enjoyed banking, so I did. I represented one bank and then worked for 2 other banks, mainly in the business side of it, maybe in collections and drawing and drafting mortgages, which tied in to a real estate practice. I did not do a lot of personal injury, did not enjoy that part of the practice, but I did enjoy the domestic law, the family law, and the banking law that I was involved with. Judge Hedges appointed me to be a member of the firms that represented the class of people that were injured in the Gaylord explosion that occurred in 1995. That litigation went on and on and on. I was appointed, I think because of my background in business, because I have a master's, my background in business, I was appointed chairman of audit and budget. So I was the one that watched the money come in and watched the money go out as far as funding the litigation, not dispersing the funds to the plaintiffs. That was done by an independent CPA firm. But yes, I was involved in that. I got to watch the technicalities and the expertise required to handle class litigations. That was very interesting. And I benefited from sitting in the courtroom many, many days watching very competent lawyers handle that part of it. And I do think my most prized relationships I have are the ones where the attorney and I fought in the beginning. I don't mean fought like calling each other names or being disrespectful, but fought like, here's my case, bud, let me hear yours, and we see where we go, and if we cannot get along, then we're going to go in front of a judge. And when you go in front of a judge with a competent attorney on the other side, you soon realize, I may be wasting my time arguing with this person. This person knows what they're doing. They can be trusted. They're doing the best they can for their client. And there's no reason after you acquire some experience that you can't sit around a table and say, this is how it should be worked out fairly. I think you see that in a movement now where mediation is becoming so important in the practice of law. You see it more and more. I know it's along the lines of personal injury, but I think it's coming along the lines in the domestic matters also. I have considered, in thinking of my past experiences, what cases would I like to hang my hat on as being proud of. There's an awful lot, without sounding braggadocious, but the ones that maybe affected more than just my client was one that I argued in front of the Louisiana Supreme Court, at which time it was the law, or interpreted to be the law, that if a husband was ordered to pay temporary spousal support, at that time it was called alimony, after the divorce, he had to continue to pay that amount. Well, that case went to the Supreme Court, and the law was changed to say, no, we're going to have, we know there are women that need, or spouses, I should say, that need support after the divorce, but it's not the same as if the divorce was just beginning. So the legislature did modify the obligation, and 9 times out of 10, someone's obligation is not as great after the divorce as it was prior to the divorce. A second issue was in adoptions. When a parent was going to give up a child for adoption, if that parent was female, that parent had to go to a doctor, or a social worker, I should say maybe, or even a psychiatrist, if I remember correctly, and certify that they've been counseled about what it would be like to give up a child. The father didn't have to do that. Well, I thought that was unfair because of nothing else, the expense of why the mother would have to go through that expense, whereas the father didn't. And I contacted our local senators, and they agreed with me, and they modified the law to say that neither parent at that time had to. Now, I think the law has been changed since then, because I haven't looked at a domestic adoption law in 10 years. But at that time, they did attempt to change the law. And the third time was when I appeared before a Senate committee on the fact that there was some movement on to say, okay, you family court judges, at that time it was Judge Devereaux and Judge Emiker, you all have jurisdiction over every issue but community property. Well, those of us that practice domestic law saw that as a big problem because everything is tied in with community property, ability to pay, division of assets, and who gets what. And we convinced the committee there that to require someone to go before 2 judges, in fact, and the scheduling of the courts because Washington Parish is in St. Tammany Parish Court also. We're in the 22nd Judicial District Court. So we share the same judges, and we are at the mercy of St. Tammany's heavy dockets. How unfair that would be for parties to go through a divorce with one judge and then have to time their community property partition and have it heard before another judge who didn't hear any of the previous aspects and contradictions and arguments that were in the marriage which brought about the divorce. So those are the three things that I'm most happy with. I think the people that affected my life would be after law school. I really do. I think that John Gillespie, I think that Richard Watts, I think that Judge Stephen Dutzer. Those three gentlemen affected my life and helped me more than any other three that I could name. Now that I have time, because I'm not totally retired, I'm partially retired, but I love to cook, and that's just not making meatballs and spaghetti. I love to make jelly. I love to make my own liqueurs. I make a wonderful orange liqueur and an amaretto, which people fight over. And I, of course, love to read, voracious reader. I go through books like other people go through Kleenex. I mean, it's just one after another. And they're not heavy books. I felt like I paid my dues reading heavy when I was practicing law and trying to keep up. Now, I like the fiction and I like detective stories. The practice took up most of my time, but I was chairman of the Riverside Board, Hospital Board here in Franklinton. Also, well, I'm a member of the Republican Women's Club, and we're very active in that. And I love to say the Garden Club. I am a member of the Garden Club. Those are they really fit in with my hobbies. As a kind, unselfish person. That's the way I would like to be remembered.